Hey, what's happening, guys? It's me, Rocco, again. And, today I'm going to be bringing you guys another Black Sabbath album review because it's mid October and it's pretty much all I've been listening to, at this time of year with the autumn coming in and everything kind of dying off. No band better suits that atmosphere than Black Sabbath. You can argue with any heavy metal band, but Black Sabbath's my favorite metal band, so I'm dedicating this whole month to Black Sabbath. So, I was kind of torn about what topic I would, talk about on this video, what album. I had previously done a lot of the classics like Sabotage, Master of Reality, some Volume 4, and then I touched upon 13, kind of bringing in some of like the newer Sabbath stuff. And I was thinking today, and I'm like, it's either going to be Never Say Die or Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And I went with Never Say Die. Not because I like it better than Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. That's like the furthest from the truth. But I just think this is such an interesting album, and I really feel like talking about it today because I feel like, although it's definitely one of the worst Black Sabbath albums, definitely from the Ozzy era, arguably, I honestly like this album a lot better than a lot of the other albums that came after this. But in the Ozzy era, it's definitely in the bottom two. Definitely this and Technical Ecstasy. And this might be a controversial opinion, but I actually like this album better than Technical Ecstasy. And I think that kind of goes against popular opinion, but that's just my preference. And I really think overall, again, I've said this multiple times in my videos, I don't like using the word underrated because music is always going to be a subjective experience. And when you're using the word underrated, like, what are you really comparing it to? I mean, every album is going to appeal to someone in one way or another. But I find that I do enjoy this album a lot more than most Black Sabbath fans. And this is an album that's really polarizing. I mean, I've seen comments of people saying that this is their favorite Sabbath album. Now, I'm no one to judge, but like personally, I can't understand that opinion. But I've also seen people saying that this album not only is one of the worst Sabbath albums, but it's a shitty album. Like musically, it's uninspired. Just everything about it is crap. And I completely disagree with that. I think there's a lot of worthwhile material on this album. And I think, a lot of people kind of just get bogged down in the history and what a lot of the band members said because the band members really do not like this album, with the exception of Bill Ward. But Ozzy has pretty much just slandered this entire album, this entire period with Sabbath. And understandably, as we'll get to when I talk more about the history. But I think that a lot of people take that, and especially with new fans, they listen to the album for the first time, with that negative kind of connotation in mind, and they kind of just give up on it. But I really think that this album takes multiple listens to get into. Now, I will give them credit. There are some pretty bad songs on the album. Like, there's some very uninspired songs, but I think the balance really does favor the good moments on the album. And it's just a very strange album. It came from a very tumultuous period in Sabbath's career. A lot of controversy, a lot of shit was happening. Like the band was just using drugs at just an incredibly excessive level. I mean, like they were just so impaired when making the album. And to summarize it in one phrase, the party was over. I mean, this was the come down of like their glory years from Volume 4 up to Sabotage, or I guess Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, when they were just they were riding high on the drugs and they were still feeling good, still inspired. This was like the fucking come down, like the suicidal period of Sabbath. And yeah, it was a really dark time, as we'll get into when I talk about the history. But I do think, they were such a great band that they didn't stop experimenting. And I really think they experimented a lot more with this album than what they did with Technical Ecstasy, which I consider to be like the most uninspired Sabbath album. I mean, I never really listened to oh my god, I can't speak today. Technical Ecstasy. The only time I do it's just to listen to Dirty Women. I always fucking forget that song. Dirty Women and oh my god, the second song on the album. It's fucking amazing. It's all right is a good track too, but the one I'm talking about is called You Won't Change Me. That's it. Yeah, so when I listen to Technical Ecstasy, I usually skip like all the other songs and just listen to those three because they are fantastic. But on this album, I usually don't skip any tracks, even though there's a few I don't like that much. I listen to it all the way through because it's a very varied album. I mean, there's a lot of diversity on this, and Sabbath really did incorporate a lot of jazz onto the album, which is hilarious because it's just so out of the blue. I mean, they're this rock band, or this metal band like riding high. You know, they had this signature sound of doom metal and just these heavy sludgy riffs, and then all of a sudden, like late in their career, they decide to just throw in some like jazz fusion elements into it, which is just hilarious and might be due to the drugs, but we'll never really know. And yeah, I could totally see how that would alienate a lot of fans. Now, I'm not trying to sound like I'm this like elevated, elitist who loves jazz music, but I really do enjoy when rock bands incorporate jazz elements into their music. I mean, Relayer by Yes, you'll see it as like my cover design. Not only is it my cover design because it's one of my favorite album covers, but I just love the jazz fusion elements on that album. And just in general, I just love jazz fusion. So, not that this album is a jazz fusion album, but they do incorporate like a lot of like jazzy elements into it, and that appeals to me. So that might be like a major factor why I actually like the album a lot more than other people. If you were an early Black Sabbath fan, you were into that heavy, doomy sound, then this album can come off as, a big turnoff. And especially with the other songs on the album, the ones that don't feature a lot of the weird jazz experimentation, they're more of like up-tempo rockers that are kind of, I don't want to say generic, some of them are generic, but, they're more up-tempo rockers. They don't really have that doomy, heavy sound of Sabbath. Now, that being said, the up-tempo rock songs on this album are a lot better than the ones on Technical Ecstasy, in my opinion. I mean, especially songs like Backstreet Kids, I was never a fan of that track. And Rock and Roll Doctor, I mean, I feel like on Technical Ecstasy, they were trying way too hard to be commercial, but on this album, they actually kind of mastered like the short, like 3-4 minute rock song of the times, and it comes across really nicely on this album. And again, like contrasting with the weird experimentation, it just makes for a really interesting listen, and it's just always stimulating to me. So I've been listening to this album now for many years, and it's always an enjoyable listen. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you guys and say like this is a masterpiece or anything, but it's definitely an enjoyable album, and I really think that it should be given a chance, because I remember when I was a kid, I'm just going to tell you guys like a little story about this. Maybe I was like 10, 11 years old when I was starting to get into Sabbath. I was absolutely obsessed with the debut album. I mean, that album, to this day, it's my favorite for both nostalgic reasons. Like, I'll freely admit, like, the nostalgia plays like a big factor in why that's my favorite one. Also, like, I love the blues and things like that. We'll get into that when I review the album. But, I was heavily into that album. And the second album I heard from Sabbath was actually Never Say Die, because it was the only album that my dad had in his record collection, on his vinyl record collection. And I saw the album cover, and I looked at it, and I see these two kind of pilots. And, as a kid, that's kind of creepy. And I'm like, the first Sabbath album, that's obviously a creepy album cover. And then this one was creeping me out as well. I didn't even know it was Sabbath. I just saw the cover, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of unsettling. Then I put it on, and like I recognized Ozzy Osbourne's voice, but I'm like, what the fuck is this? It's fucking horrible. I actually hated the album, and I think I only heard the first 2 tracks on it, and I just gave up. And then I'd gone to the other Sabbath albums, became a big fan, and I kind of like left this on the back burner, because I'm like, why the fuck, like, why is this the only album you own on your vinyl collection? And apparently he told me a story, he had them all, but then, like, he lent him to his friend. They never returned him. Those fucking bastards. And it's funny because they probably returned Never Say Die. So, that speaks to the album. That speaks to, like, its reputation. But yeah, like, I really think it does take multiple listens, because I went back to it again, and I'm like, I'm going to revisit this. And again, I didn't like it at first. I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, you got, like, a simple rock song followed by, like, a weird, piano-driven jazz track, and it was just all over the place. But again, over the years, it stuck with me, and I should mention this before I proceed with the review, that I'm going to give a shout out to the Eternal Idols channel, the Ralph Vieira channel with Black Sabbath. I've watched all his reviews. They're fucking amazing, man. If you're watching, I love all your reviews. And, he really hit close to home when he's like, Never Say Die is one of my least favorite Ozzy era albums, but it's my most listened to. And I was thinking about it, and like, the very day that I watched that video, like, I had listened to Never Say Die. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? Like, lately I've been listening to Never Say Die a lot. And I haven't heard Paranoid in like a month or 2 months or so. So it really goes to show that, although the quality of this album might not be up to scratch compared to the other Ozzy albums, it's definitely interesting. And for someone who's always trying to, like, be mentally stimulated by music, that really appealed to me. So, I'm kind of rambling on. So now let's get into the history behind this album, which is very, very interesting. So yeah, guys, as I kind of alluded to, the first thing I want to address is the drug use of Sabbath at the time. I mean, starting with Volume 4, they had gotten heavily into cocaine, heavily into other substances, and it was great. I mean, they were, I'm no drug addict or anything, but like the band was riding high on the drugs. They were just cranking out these experimental masterpieces. And as I mentioned in one of my previous Sabbath reviews, I think the drugs really were instrumental in that creative process. Um, and yeah, everything was going great. And then Sabotage hit. And if you want to get some more backstory on that, just go back to my Sabotage review. I talk all about like how they were being screwed over by their management, and it was just a really depressing time for Sabbath. I mean, they had to go through all this fucking litigation, but they came out of the shithole smelling like roses because they released Sabotage, and honestly, it's finally getting the recognition it deserves as one of the greatest metal albums of all time, because it really is. It really is a masterpiece. And they were coming off of that, and then things went downhill. I mean, things with the drugs were just getting out of hand. It was kind of like the come down period. The drugs weren't doing it for them anymore. They were kind of just reaching like the ultimate addiction, the ultimate, like, they were in like the ultimate depths of addiction is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, basically Tony Iommi was the only one like who was still kind of inspired at this point. Right before Technical Ecstasy, Ozzy Osbourne just really wasn't into Sabbath anymore. I mean, he really had these like, I was gonna say delusions, but he really had these, thoughts of like quitting the band, forming a solo career. He already had a name for it, The Blizzard of Oz, which, as we all know, would be the title of his first album, masterpiece. And he really wasn't into it. It was just really an uninspired time for Sabbath. And Tony Iommi was trying to push the band, believe it or not, into a more commercial direction. So the result was Technical Ecstasy, which is my least favorite Ozzy era album. It's not a horrible album, but honestly, I really only come back to it for those 3 tracks because it's just really generic and commercialized, and you could tell the band wasn't putting much effort into it. So Ozzy, at this point, he really wasn't into it. And coming around 1977, he actually left the band. A lot of people forget this because we all know Ozzy was fired after Never Say Die, but he actually left the band in 77 to try to like do his own thing. And the rest of the band were, they didn't want him to leave. They didn't, they really didn't want him to leave, but like they couldn't really bring themselves to say it. Whether that be because like they came from Birmingham and they were trying to be like macho, macho bastards or whatever you want to call them. But yeah, they couldn't bring themselves to like beg Ozzy to come back, and it was really hurting Bill Ward. As we all know, Ozzy and Bill Ward were really tight, really close friends, and just everything was going to shit. So what does Tony Iommi do? He calls up his friend Dave Walker, who was previously in Fleetwood Mac. I didn't even know that, and I consider myself like a pretty big Fleetwood Mac fan. More of it like the Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham era, but yeah, apparently this guy Dave Walker was in the band, and he was good friends with Tony Iommi. So Tony called him up and said, "Hey, listen, like Ozzy fucking left the band," and presumably Dave Walker shit his pants after that phone call because honestly, like replacing the lead singer in one of the most iconic bands of all time must have been just extremely intimidating. But he was up to the challenge. And they actually started writing some songs. They even performed, I believe, one concert. And, things were kind of like, shaping up. But then, believe it or not, Dave Walker actually ran into Ozzy at a bar. And, Ozzy was probably fucking wasted. But they were talking, and it was obvious that Ozzy was kind of like ambivalent about leaving Sabbath. And, he was thinking of coming back. And, at that point, Dave Walker was kind of just like, okay, like this isn't going to last too long. And sure enough, Ozzy came back into the band. He came knocking back, and he's like, take me back, guys. And the band, they didn't really put up a fight, so that ended the brief stint with Dave Walker, which is hilarious because he just fully accepted it. Yeah, he's like, Ozzy's coming back. I might as well just leave the band. And he didn't put up much of a fight. But, yeah, who knows what became of him. I got to research that shit. I probably should have done before the video, but I'm lazy. So anyway, Ozzy's back in the band. And what do? They go to Toronto to write and record it. And, when I first learned about this, I found it hilarious because I'm from Toronto. It's my hometown. Like, I just live on the outskirts of town in, like, the suburbs. and a nearby town. And it's just hilarious because they came to Toronto for tax reasons, I guess, to evade taxes in Britain or America or whatever else. And it was fucking miserable. I mean, they were saying it was like the dead of winter. They were freezing their fucking asses off, which I could definitely sympathize with. It's freaking cold in Toronto in the winter, and it's not fun. But yeah, they came to record for like financial reasons, and it took them fucking 5 months to write and record this album. So yeah, guys, the sessions for this album were extremely fucked up, extremely disorganized, and just took them forever to get shit done. I mean, there were days they would go into the studio, they'd be fucking pissed drunk, wasted, and they wouldn't even get to recording. They would just put it off to the next day, and then the next day became the next week, and it was just a mess. I mean, no one was into it. Even Tony Iommi, the most motivated member of the band, was kind of like, just going with the flow at this point. And to make matters worse, Ozzy Osbourne was very adamant about not singing any of the tracks they recorded with Dave Walker. And there were quite a few, most notably Junior's Eyes they recorded. So Geezer Butler had to write totally different lyrics. They had to like totally rework these songs. And it was just a time-consuming process. Not to mention, Ozzy was on Geezer's back complaining about the lyrics, saying, I can't sing this, I can't sing that. And honestly, shut the fuck up, Ozzy. Geezer Butler is one of my favorite lyricists of all time. Technically, he isn't one of the best. Like, I'm not putting him up there with Bob Dylan or Neil Young or Peter Gabriel, for example. But, I love his lyrics. I mean, they really hit close to home and they really evoke a lot of emotions. So for Ozzy Osbourne, someone who's written very few lyrics in the band, The Writ, Black Sabbath, great stuff. But for him to criticize Geezer Butler was kind of a dick move. And I feel for Geezer Butler. But yeah, it was just a really time-consuming process. And again, no one was into it. Ozzy would come into the studio and they'd be doing all this jazzy, there would be a horn section and like all this weird stuff. And he'd be like, what the fuck is this? I believe in one interview, oh my god, this cracks me up every time. He's like, you might as well call the band Slack Haddock instead of Black Sabbath, which is just, I love how he even like came to that. I feel like he just pulled that saying out of thin air, but it's freaking hilarious. And it's true because like the band really weren't, in the spirit of their original sound. Like there's very little blues on this album, very little anything that sounds heavy, anything that sounds doomy. I mean, it's a very, kind of, as I mentioned before, very up-tempo, a lot of like jazz elements, a lot of unconventional elements, and really weird, to be honest. I mean, there are a lot of parts on this album where it's like, holy fuck, is that really Black Sabbath? And you will think to yourself, like, what the hell's going on? So Ozzy really hates it. I mean, he looks back on this period as one of the darkest in Sabbath history, and I don't blame him. But yeah, he slanders this album. He totally trashes it. He thinks it's the worst piece of shit he ever had anything to do with. And, Bill Ward is really the only guy who kind of sticks by and says, you know what, we were fucked up, but at least we were still trying to experiment. At least we were still trying to do something. Whereas on Technical Ecstasy, it was just kind of like, going with the motions, trying to be commercial. And it's really interesting, So they recorded the album. It took them fucking forever. And they go out on tour. The album didn't do as well. It only went to like number 30 something in the US. Did pretty well in the UK. Came to number 12, so that's not bad. But then again, I'm sure at this point they were just kind of like riding high on their like established status as one of the best bands. And yeah, so they went on tour, and who opened for them? None other than Van Halen. So think about it. We're in 1978 now, late 1978. Van Halen was just starting out. They came out with their debut. They're this young band, energetic, just hungry, trying to conquer the music scene. And then you have Black Sabbath. Fucking veterans at this point, believe it or not. Even though only 8 years went by, they're already 8 albums into their fucking career, and the first 5 came out in the first 4 years, which is just incredible. Or the first 6, actually. Oh, no, yeah, the first 5. Anyway, so they're like, they're on drugs, they're high, they're fucking uninspired, and they're touring with this young, energetic band. So, that's already, a problem. And to make matters worse, Tony Iommi wasn't getting along with Eddie Van Halen, believe it or not. Because when they were opening up for them, they would actually play some Sabbath songs. And Tony Iommi thought they were kind of like taking the piss out of them. And later on, he realized, Eddie Van Halen was a huge fan of Sabbath, and he was just trying to pay tribute. He had the best intentions, but at the time, I guess in his cocaine-fueled stupor, Tony Iommi really like took offense to that. And yeah, eventually down the road, they were kind of like, they kind of made amends. But it was just a disaster, this tour. I mean, there's a famous story where Ozzy Osbourne, he fucking slept through an entire day. I mean, he went to bed, and then he woke up at 6 o'clock thinking he missed the show, but it was really the next day. So, or he woke up at 6 o'clock thinking I don't know, I can't remember the exact details, but basically he missed the show because he was fucking sleeping and trashed out of his mind all day. And that caused a riot, apparently, because the band had to cancel the show. And it was just a complete fucking mess. I mean, like, he was clearly not into it, clearly out of it. And, compared to the other band members who were also heavily into drugs, he was just on a whole other level. So, unfortunately, the history books were written, and Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath. And that ends the whole Ozzy Osbourne period. He wouldn't come back until he came back in the 90s to do like the Ozfest shows, but like their next studio album with Ozzy would come in 2013, which is insane. I mean, miracles do happen. But yeah, that was the end of the Ozzy Osbourne era of Black Sabbath. And honestly, it had to end. It was just, it wasn't going anywhere for anyone. Everyone was fucked up. And honestly, I think it worked out for the best because Ozzy, he didn't get himself clean, but Sharon Osbourne really did save his life. And he had an extremely successful solo career. The first two Ozzy solo albums are just like, wow, like incredible. And Black Sabbath, as we all know, teamed up with Dio, recorded 2 fantastic albums, and a lot of other good underrated albums after with Tony Martin, like, not Seventh Star, what's the fucking, Eternal Idol's really good, and then again with Dio, Dehumanizer is just top-notch shit. And I really think it worked out. So, they had to fire him. It didn't work out well, but, it really had to happen. And, yeah, we're just left with Never Say Die as kind of like a document to this era of Black Sabbath. And, honestly, I touched on a lot of the points earlier, so the overall review is going to be pretty brief. But basically what it comes down to is that this album is just very eclectic. And I mean, again, it could be because of the drugs. It could be because, the band were truly trying to experiment. We don't know. But I do like that because, compared to Technical Ecstasy, we don't have a lot of those generic rockers. Again, I've probably said this 100 times by now, but there's a lot of, like, jazz influence. A lot of, it's a shame that there isn't much of that heavy sound. But then again, we're in the late 70s now. Like, a lot of punk was coming out at the time. And, a lot of new wave and stuff. And, like, I think that sound really... Black Sabbath really did all they could with that at this point, and they really had to progress their sound and really try something new. And they had been doing that since like the early 70s. I mean, from Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath and onward, the band was just really, really experimenting. So honestly, I don't even care that this album isn't like a doom metal album. It's just an interesting listen. And yeah, it's definitely underrated. And Ozzy even says like the last good album they made was Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. He's on fucking drugs. He forgets about Sabotage. That's an amazing album. But I'll forgive him. He's Ozzy, so he's probably wasted. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the album before I get into like the individual tracks. I mean, the band members themselves, Ozzy Osbourne's vocals, awesome. Tony Iommi's guitar, there's some great playing on the album. The riffs aren't as great, aren't as memorable, but he does have some pretty great solos on the album. There's some great keyboard playing by Don Airey, who was recently joined the album. I always thought it was Rick Wakeman because Rick Wakeman did do some keyboard work on previous albums like Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. But no, it's Don Airey, and he does a pretty great job. There's some great Bill Ward drumming on it, a lot of jazz. Bill Ward even sings a song on it. And the band is just, they're playing pretty well. There aren't many moments that leave you like really speechless. Like a lot of the other Sabbath albums had like huge moments. Even Technical Ecstasy with Dirty Women, that solo at the end is just, oh my god. But this album does have a lot of moments that, just keep you engaged. So I love it. Needless to say, I love it a lot more than most people. Now let's get into the track by track review so I can talk about a lot of like the specifics. So kicking off the album, they come in with the title track, Never Say Die. And this song here is just a perfect example of what I was talking about with Sabbath on this album, doing these really nice, upbeat, kind of like, just hard rockin' tunes, just hard upbeat songs. Not a shred of metal in sight, not a shred of doom rock. And it's just just a really good time, a really enjoyable track. And I don't think any Sabbath fans could really deny how good this song is. I mean, a lot of people really cite this song as being like the only good track on the album, which I completely disagree with, but it's definitely like one of the better ones. Like it's probably in the top 4 or the top 5 at least. And yeah, so pretty strong track. The thing I really love about this song is during the part where Ozzy's singing, "Don't you ever have to worry." I love how Tony Iommi's guitar kind of builds up in the background and kind of mirrors that. It gives the song like a surprisingly kind of like epic feel to it, and just brings in that, some emotion into it. Because the main theme of the song is just really poppy, really upbeat, and there isn't much emotion behind it. But then when Ozzy starts singing that, you can kind of feel like this guitar swelling up from the abyss with the like it's like kind of like a crescendo, to be honest. And yeah, there's some really interesting Iommi playing on this song, especially when Ozzy's singing "Don't You Ever Say Die." There's some like jangly guitar in the background, just some really cool stuff, some really unexpected playing. And it's always a great time whenever this song comes on. It always just gets me fired up, and a great way to kick off the album. I got no complaints. So I'm going to give this track a really strong 8 out of 10. I really enjoy it. Okay, guys, track 2. This is where the album starts to get pretty interesting with Johnny Blade. A much lengthier track than Never Say Die, about double the length, coming in at about I believe 6.5 minutes. So it's kind of like a mini Black Sabbath epic. And this is just a really weird, unconventional Sabbath song, like a lot of the other songs on this album. And again, it's one of the favorites of the album. A lot of people really consider this and the title track to be the 2 better songs. And honestly, I have kind of like a love-hate relationship with this track. I mean, the first time I heard it, the first time like I revisited the album, because again, the first time I heard this album, I hated it. But there were parts of this song that I absolutely loved. And then there were other parts that I felt like could have been improved on or were kind of irritating. So overall, I do like the song, and like it's still an enjoyable listen. But I do want to address some of the things I don't like about it. So first of all, I don't know, just like the whole like, I don't know how you word, the lyrics are kind of cheesy. That's the only way I could kind of describe it. But also just Ozzy's delivery of the lyrics kind of irritates me at some points. Especially when he's saying Johnny Blade, Johnny Blade, and he's just repeating the word Johnny Blade in this like irritating high-pitched voice. That always kind of ruined the song for me, like in the early days of listening to it. And also kind of like the whole tone on this song, the guitar tone at the end, it just sounds kind of like high-pitched and irritating. But it's fantastic guitar playing, but the tone of it itself is just really just irritating to me. I don't know, maybe it's just me. But overall, there's a lot more pros to this song than cons, so I still really do enjoy the song. I mean, just the way it starts off with that creepy organ intro kind of reminds me of like the Mr. Crawley intro from Blizzard of Oz, and I believe it's the same keyboard player with Don Airey, so that's kind of interesting. And just a really weird thing. It feels like you're sounds kind of like, horror themed, like kind of like a Dracula, kind of like something out of a Dracula movie. And then it evolves into this weird kind of like synth, spacey kind of solo with the and then all of a sudden like Ozzy's coming in, tortured and twisted, and you get this hard rock riff in the background. And it's just really bizarre to have that spacey kind of synthesizer with Tony Iommi's hard rock riffs going on in the background. Just like a really weird contrast. And again, the verses of the song are really good. Ozzy does a fantastic job. It's just the specific parts where he's singing Johnny Blade just really kind of irritate me. But there's this one part where this really awesome riff comes in, probably the heaviest riff on the album, with the and then Ozzy sings, "You know that Johnny's a spider." That part right there just gets me going every time. Just phenomenal. And then, of course, the solo at the end of the song is what most people talk about. It's just a great Iommi solo. Really climactic, really frantic. And it really feels like the song like accelerates up until this point, and then it just lets loose. But really fantastic solo. Again, like the high-pitched tone of it kind of irritates me, but overall, some great playing. And, throughout the song, the keyboards tend to come back in with that synth kind of, with that weird synthesizer sound. And again, creating that weird contrast with the hard rock and guitar. So, you know what? Really interesting song. There's some parts I don't like about it, but I'm still going to give it an 8 out of 10 because there's some parts that I absolutely love on this track. So definitely check it out and let me know your opinion below. I'm curious about, if the parts that bothered me bothered anyone else or vice versa. So moving on. You're coming home again tomorrow. I'm sorry it won't be for long. With all the pain of what you live within, I'll try my hardest not to cry when it is time to say goodbye. Alright guys, then we get to track 3, Junior's Eyes. And this one here, it's no secret. I tell everyone I love this track. This is probably my favorite song that Black Sabbath recorded from 1976 till 1980. Basically the whole second half of the 70s. That was just a shit show for Sabbath, as I already alluded to. And by far my favorite track on the album. I mean, everything about it is great. And I really think this is probably the unsung hero of the album. Well, this and another track we'll get to later. But honestly, it's hard to think that any Sabbath fan could dislike the song. I mean, everything about it's fantastic. And again, this is one of the songs they wrote when Dave Walker was in the band, with totally different lyrics originally. And then Ozzy came in, criticized Geezer's, like, I refuse to sing this shit. So they had to totally rework the lyrics. And I'm glad they did, because they made the song about Ozzy's father, who had recently died. I believe his name was Jack Osborne, who was always like a very supportive figure in Ozzy's life. And, it just comes across because it's a really emotional track. Ozzy's just firing on all cylinders. His singing is just flawless on the song. And what really makes it amazing is the chorus. I mean, the chorus of this track is just mind-blowing. It's so catchy. It's so evocative. It's so emotional. And not only the chorus, but the guitar playing during the chorus is just amazing. I mean, you got the hard rock riff grounding the track, but then on top of that, you have this like mournful, muted kind of guitar playing over that, which is just great. I mean, just really gives the song like a mournful kind of haunting feel to it. And they knew the chorus was strong because the song repeats the chorus 3 times, and the fade out of the song is also kind of like the theme of the chorus without the vocals, and just a nice play out on that, that mournful guitar tone I was just talking about. And it's just incredible. I mean, it leaves me speechless every time how people could really look at songs like Johnny Blade and Never Say Die and then just totally forget about Junior's Eyes. Like, this is the one, guys. This is the song. But that's just my opinion. And just it's a little frustrating how the song starts. It starts off with this like amazing funky bass riff by Geezer Butler, but it's so quiet. I mean, like, I wish they kind of like amplified that, because it kind of gives the song the impression that it's just gonna be like a funky kind of laid back track, but then it explodes with that chorus, and I feel like the intro should have been like more reflective of that. But really cool bass playing by Geezer, and yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I should say about it. It's just amazing. A 9 out of 10 for me. It's just really great. And yeah, really strong track. So moving on. guys, and then we get the track 4, and this is where I think the album kind of like dips a little bit in quality. I mean, you had 3 really strong tracks coming before it, and now you got a hard road, which the main problem I have with this song is that it's kind of overlong, coming in at 6 minutes, and there really isn't much of interest to this track. I mean, it just kind of sounds like an arena rocker, really catchy chorus, really poppy hooks, but overall, not much of interest to it. I mean, the best part of the song is actually the fade out, where the band members are chanting the chorus, always a hard road, and then you got Ozzy kind of singing in the background, and I don't know who's singing this part, but there's a few like oohs in the background, and if it's Ozzy, that's hilarious. But I have a feeling it's Bill Ward for some reason. But yeah, just a really kind of standard arena rock kind of song. Nothing much of interest to it, and it's pretty autobiographical. I mean, I think at this point the band had realized that the last 5 years had been a really hard road, for lack of a better word, and I think they're kind of like pouring it out into this song, and it really has an optimistic feel to it at the end of the day, based on the tone. But it's just it's just nothing special. And 6 minutes for a song like this I feel like it's a bit too long. So I'm just gonna give it maybe like a 7 or a 7.5 out of 10, kind of in that range right there. It's decent. It's not a bad song by any stretch of the imagination, but it isn't just nowhere near as good as Junior's Eyes, which came right before it. Hey guys, so I'm an idiot and I ended up deleting my review for Shockwave, which is track 5, after uploading it to my computer and didn't notice until now. So I'm just gonna do a quick on-the-fly review of Shockwave just to recap my thoughts on the song. So basically Shockwave, another interesting song on the album. It's another one of those like harder rockin' songs. But there's a lot of pop hooks on this song, like a lot of pop hooks. And all of them are really melodic and really memorable. And, show like a lighthearted side to the band, which is like in really strong contrast to the lyrics of the song, which if you read the lyrics on the song, they're extremely kind of disturbing. Like it sounds like they're describing a lot of like occult things, and like the poppiness of the tune just kind of goes against that. There's also this really cool part at the end with these kind of like not doo-wop vocals, but the whole band singing together, the with this heavy riff in the background, and it's hilarious. It's the most un-Sabbath thing ever. But yeah, really enjoyable track, a lot of pop hooks, really memorable, and I got no complaints. There's also a pretty crazy guitar solo by Iommi, so I have no complaints there. I'm going to give it a strong 7.5 out of 10. Alright guys, then we get to track 6, Air Dance. Okay guys, now this is the song I really want to talk about on this album because it's probably the most unconventional Black Sabbath song, and for the better. I mean, like, I really love what Sabbath was doing on this track. You'll notice like early on in the review I mentioned they had a lot of jazzy elements on this album, and really up till now we've had more of like hard rock, kind of like there was some weird synth on Johnny Blade, but this is where the jazz kicks in. And like from this song onward, the jazz elements really play a big role in the making of this album. And Air Dance is probably like the prime example of the song. I mean, it's just a really strange, really unconventional Sabbath track. And I've watched a review of this album recently where someone was talking about like how forgettable this album was. And they mentioned Air Dance. It's like you couldn't even pay me to remember how Air Dance goes. And I was just thinking like, of all the songs to forget from this album, you're going to forget Air Dance? which is probably the most interesting and most varied track on the album. So it's just further supporting my opinion that like a lot of people really don't listen to this album enough because there is just so much going on in this track and there's a lot to break down. It starts off with this pretty kind of like power metal kind of sounding solo. Sorry, I mean riff with the and you think it's gonna be like kind of this like upbeat rockin' track again, but then all of a sudden it kind of like dies down and like divulges into this this kind of like jazzy piano part, and the piano's like really in your face. I mean, they really bring the piano to the forefront, and it's just really kind of like virtuosic. Like you can tell Don Airey was kind of really showing off on the piano, which could be, kind of distracting for some people. And Ozzy does a great job on the song too. Like, I mean, he's singing it, and it's really atmospheric, really laid back, and it's a really dreamlike kind of track, kind of similar to Planet Caravan and Solitude, but more on like the kind of like the jazzy side, the progressive rock side, dare I say it. And yeah, it's just this really, really dreamlike track, as I mentioned, unlike anything they ever did. And some tasty guitar playing in the background, believe it or not. Some really like, emotional playing from Tony Iommi. And then eventually the song totally winds down into this really spacey part, which is awesome. I mean, I love it. And eventually this like triumphant kind of sounding riff comes in with the kind of like reprising the initial riff of the song, but not quite. And then, oh my God, guys, before you know it, the craziest transition comes in and this extremely jazzy section comes in, and Don Airey is just playing the weirdest kind of like really like the epitome of like progressive rock kind of wankery, if you could look at it that way. But it's just so weird for Sabbath. I mean, you could really tell how Ozzy walked into the studio, heard them playing stuff like this, and then just walked right out thinking like, what the hell happened to my band? Because it's just totally out of left field. And I freaking love it. I mean, this is one of my favorite tracks on the album. And I think, again, it's just one of the most interesting, one of the most experimental. And whether that be because of all the fucking drugs they were doing, like maybe they were brain damaged at the time, it just makes for a really cool listen. And really interesting track. Probably the most interesting Sabbath song from like the later half of their 70s career. So yeah, I definitely recommend the song Air Dance. And for you people who forget how it goes, definitely go back and listen to it. And I got to give another shout out to Ralph Vieira for really emphasizing how great this song was on his Never Say Die review, which was really cool. It made me go back and really listen to it in more detail and really come to that appreciation of it. So thanks a lot, man. And yeah, and then starting here, actually, no, the next song's really good too. But then the final two tracks really take a nosedive. And those are the ones that really, they're the real like stinkers of the album. But Air Dance is fantastic, and the next song, Over to You, is also top-notch shit. So let's get on to that. Alright, and then we got track number 7, which is a really cool one called Over to You. And again, kind of like Air Dance, this song really does incorporate a lot of those jazzy elements, especially with Don Airey's piano playing. I mean, actually only Don Airey's piano playing. The guitar riffs and the vocals aren't really jazzy in nature, but you got this like weird kind of like piano in the background, kind of giving the song that feel, which is really cool. And I mean, I hope they paid that guy well. I mean, because Don Airey is just all over this half of the album. I mean, he's pretty much on every track from here on out. And he just does a really good job on the keyboards. I mean, some might say he's just trying to show off. I mean, like, it's really in-your-face piano playing, but I like it. And I mean, the main riff of the song's pretty cool. It's this nice drive-in kind of, feel good, upbeat, jaunty kind of riff. And Ozzy does a pretty good job. My only criticism is like the actual lyrics of the track aren't that great. I mean, the chorus, future looks blue, over to you, just kind of seems pretty like simplistic and meaningless for for someone as great as Geezer Butler, who's written such classics as Children of the Grave, After Forever, Lord of this World, like masterpieces like that. The lyrics really did take a toll on the album. And I really think that, maybe Ozzy had, you know, Geezer kind of like complains that Ozzy had criticized his lyrics a lot, especially in the later days. But I really think that Ozzy was kind of justified because if you look at Technical Ecstasy in this album, the lyrics definitely, took a major step down compared to like the earlier albums. And I probably should have mentioned that earlier on, but yeah, Geezer's lyrics probably they really suffer on this album. I mean, they're not that great, but other than that, it's a pretty cool song. Again, the piano playing by Don Aries, just I give it the thumbs up, and the guitar playing in the main verse of the song is really catchy. So just another cool track on the album, and I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10 around there. And now the album really does take a nosedive, and it's a shame because the last two tracks are arguably the worst, and yeah, it kind of leaves like a sour taste in your mouth after you listen to it, but yeah. But think about it. So far we've had some classics. Never Say Die, Junior's Eyes, Air Dance, and those were like the main ones, but like the other ones were pretty good up till this point. So, the album can afford a few shitty tracks at the end. Okay, I'm sorry, guys, but track 8, Breakout, is one of the worst Black Sabbath songs of all time. I mean, it's just horrible. I mean, it's just this weird, repetitive, kind of like saxophone. I can't believe I'm saying this in a Black Sabbath video, but a saxophone riff, or sorry, trumpet riff with like this weird avant-garde saxophone playing over it. And it's just so repetitive and so weird, so out of left field for Sabbath. But unlike Air Dance and Johnny Blade and things like that. It just isn't good. I mean, like they're experimenting, but it doesn't pay off. I mean, it's just an incredibly simplistic and repetitive trumpet riff with the and then you got that weird like saxophone playing over it, and it's just a short 2.5 minute instrumental that really adds nothing to the album. Probably the second worst Sabbath song next to FX from Volume 4. But I don't even count FX because it's like a minute or something. So this probably is the worst Black Sabbath song. I can't think of a worse song than this. And, again, I can really understand how Ozzy was, really got disenchanted with Black Sabbath after hearing the band playing something like this. It's just really, uninspired, disheartening. And I feel like they just put it on the album to prove that they were like jazzy and edgy and, thinking outside the box, but it's just disgusting. Anyway, I'll give it like maybe like a 6 out of 10 at best because like the sax is kind of, like it's not horrible playing. Like the playing is not bad, but it's just such an uninspired song. So I hate to say it, but I dislike a Black Sabbath song. So yeah. And we're sad and sorry. We're sorry that it happened that way. Yes, we're so sorry. And then finally, ending off the album, we got Swingin' the Chain. Honestly, I have no fucking idea what this song's about. I'm not going to pretend I have any idea what this song's about. But it is just, I don't know, it's just not a good way to go out for Black Sabbath, especially with the Ozzy years. And, thank God they made the album 13 because it totally redeems, like, this being, like, the last Ozzy-era Sabbath song. It's just such a weird track. I mean, first of all, Bill Ward sings it. It's the second song that Bill Ward sings in the whole Sabbath canon. The first being It's Alright from Technical Ecstasy, which is actually a fantastic song. But this one here, sadly, it's just not as good. I mean, it's a really bluesy track. So a lot of blues elements rather than jazz. A lot of harmonica playing, I'm assuming by Ozzy Osbourne. And it's just a really, really bluesy way to end the album, which is just, kind of interesting because we had a lot of like, classic rock influence on the first half of the album and then a lot of jazz influence. And then we're getting some blues rock. So again, a very varied Black Sabbath album. And, Bill Ward does a good job. I like his voice, believe it or not. Should probably check out his solo career because I heard his first solo album is actually pretty good. But this song here is just, again, it just doesn't do it for me. It's not really a bad song, but I don't know. It just doesn't. Again, like Breakout, I feel like they just put it on the album to kind of like just for the sake of putting like a blues inspired song on the album. And there is like a cool riff change like later on in the song, a cool time change, but again, it doesn't really do it for me. And just it just leaves a sour taste in my mouth because like the last song on the last Ozzy album, well, except for 13, is sung by Bill Ward, and I find that like, you know, it's just a really weird way to send off that whole era of the band. But of course, at that point, they didn't really know Ozzy was going to leave the band again, but of course he did. Well, he got fired actually, so yeah. Anyway, Swinging the Chain, just uninspired song finishing off the album. So yeah, not the best track, unfortunately. I might give it like a 6.5 out of 10 at best. And yeah, there we have it, guys. That's Never Say Die, the eighth and final Ozzy era album until 2013, which is again just insane. And although I kind of did like kind of trash the last few songs on the album, overall I think it's a very strong effort from Sabbath. Definitely not as good as their classic period, because again, what is? I mean, from their debut album all the way to Sabotage, I consider that like an unmatched era in heavy metal. I mean, that's just that run of albums is just simply legendary. And but Never Say Die does have a lot of interesting moments. I love how they brought jazz into the fold, especially with the second half of the album. Although it was like hit or miss with the jazz elements, it was really good. Don Airey did a fantastic job on the keyboards, and Ozzy Osbourne's singing is just fantastic. Again, to summarize, Geezer Butler's lyrics weren't as great, and Tony Iommi's riffs weren't as doomy, weren't as heavy. But for people that are willing to give a chance to this album, I think you'll really get a lot out of it. There's a lot of interesting moments, and I really think it should be given a lot more credit than Technical Ecstasy, because at least they were trying something new. At least they were really kind of like pushing themselves as a band. Whereas on Technical Ecstasy, they were really trying to create a commercial sounding album. So yeah, Never Say Die, I'm going to give it a thumbs up. I love the album. I love listening to it. And again, I fully acknowledge it's no masterpiece, but it's definitely good. So, in conclusion, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it as always. And, hopefully I'll be pumping out some more album reviews from Sabbath in the month of October, because it's fucking October. And, yeah, I'm thinking of starting some Dio reviews, maybe a little Dehumanizer, maybe a little Heaven and Hell. Who knows? But yeah, I appreciate you guys for watching, and take it easy and listen to Never Say Die. Subscribe!